Okay, today I'm going over the section in chapter 4 called The Ego and False Autonomy. It is reasonable to ask how the mind could ever have made the ego. In fact, it is the best question you could ask, says Jesus. There is, however, no point in giving an answer in terms of the past because the past does not matter. And history would not exist if the same errors were not being repeated in the present. So those are just fancy words to say that the past does not exist. The past only appears to exist because in the present, in the now moment, which is the only thing that really exists, we keep repeating the same mistake over and over again. We keep believing in the ego over and over and over again. So that's why he's saying it's a great question for us to ask how the mind could ever have made the ego. He's saying, however, there's no point in even giving an answer to it. Why? Because it's not real. The ego wasn't really made. It hasn't really happened. And it's just a mistake that we keep repeating over and over again. And then we call that thing our past. We call it time. We call it our history. But it's just making the same mistaken choice in each now moment, choosing ego instead of spirit. Abstract thought applies to knowledge because knowledge is completely impersonal, and examples are irrelevant to its understanding. Perception, however, is always specific and therefore quite concrete. So he's telling us that perception is of the ego world and knowledge is something completely impersonal. Okay, egos are all about personal, specific. We're specific individuals, right? We have differences. There's things that make us unique in the ego world. But in the world of God, we are all the same. And the knowledge that we hold in the world of God is stable and completely impersonal because there are no individuals there. Things in this world are abstract and things in this world are specific. So our truth is really an abstract concept that is very difficult for our ego minds to even understand. Because in the ego world, everything is concrete and made of specifics. Everyone makes an ego or a self for himself, which is subject to enormous variation because of its instability. Okay, egos, the world of egos, the mistaken perception of egos is completely unstable. He also makes an ego for everyone else he perceives, which is equally variable, right? Equally unstable. Because we are deciding in our mind who we are, which is a mistaken decision, and then we are deciding who everyone else is, which is also a mistaken decision. Because as long as we are thinking that people are separate individuals, we are mistaken about who they really are, and then we are giving them an ego. Their interaction, meaning egos, is a process that alters both because they were not made by or with the unalterable. So the unalterable is everything of the world of God, and things that change are in the world of ego. That's why when two egos come together, they appear to cause change to each other. But Jesus is telling us that's not really true. It's all an illusion. Everything that is real is constant and stable. It is important to realize that this alteration can and does occur as readily when the interaction takes place in the mind as when it involves physical interaction. Okay, that sentence was a mouthful. And what he means there is that this alteration, meaning when egos come together, that they appear to change one another, can and does occur when two egos come together physically, but also, he's saying, not just that, also in our mind. So when we just think of someone else as an ego and just think judgments, it is the same as when we are interacting physically with someone else. It's the same because it's all coming from our mind. None of it is real. So whether we are actually physically saying something or doing something to someone, or we're just thinking those things about that person, the same damage is being done within our mind. We are choosing ego. We are choosing against love when we do that. But we don't know. It's a habit. It's something we fell asleep and we're dreaming. And most of us are simply not aware that this is happening. That's what the Course is teaching us. There could be no better example that the ego is only an idea and not a fact. He's saying that because we don't even have to come together physically in order to affect someone, and we can just do it in our mind, meaning making the wrong choice, believing someone is a separate ego. When we do that, that is a perfect example of how the ego is only an idea and not a fact, because all of that came from our mind. It's just an idea, a mistaken idea. Your own state of mind is a good example of how the ego was made, meaning our split mind. When you threw knowledge away, it is as if you never had it, meaning we completely have forgotten that we are one with God and one with one another. It's as if we never had the knowledge to begin with. That's how deeply asleep we are. This is so apparent that one need only recognize it to see that it does happen. So we just need to start paying attention to what the ego does, and then we can very clearly see what is happening. If this occurs in the present, meaning making the choice for the ego, why is it surprising that it occurred in the past? Surprise is a reasonable response to the unfamiliar, though hardly to something that occurs with such persistence. Again, he's politely roasting us and telling us if we keep choosing ego over and over and over again, why are we surprised that we have a split mind? And why are we surprised that we did this in the past? There is no past. There is only the present moment. And because we forgot and we are so deeply asleep, we keep choosing the ego, which is why there appears to be time and why there appears to be a past when we made that choice. And he's telling us that we continuously make that choice, choosing the ego with persistence. We have been very persistent about it. But do not forget that the mind need not work that way, right? We don't have to do that. We don't have to choose the ego, even though it does work that way now, he's telling us. So now, as we're asleep in this mistaken illusory dream, it appears to work that way now. But he's saying, don't forget, you can make a different choice. You can wake up from this dream, he's telling us. Think of the love of animals for their offspring and the need they feel to protect them. Okay, even us, humans or animals, I'm talking about our children or any animal that has offspring. We feel the need to protect them, don't we? That is because, he says, they regard them as a part of themselves. When we have babies, we consider them as an extension of ourself, as part of ourself, and that's why we feel we need to protect them. No one dismisses something he considers part of himself. You react to your ego much as God does to his creations, with love, protection, and charity. All right? So he's pointing out that we have put our love, our protection, and our charity in the wrong place. We have put it in a place to protect our ego and to protect other egos. That is what he's explaining to us. So in our natural state, being one with God, we have the same reaction that God does. We just mistakenly use that reaction. So in the real world, God really does love us and protects us and has charity with us. That's why we take our love, our protection, and our charity, and we mistakenly put it into the ego world. But those are natural desires for us because we are one with God, and that is what God naturally does with us. He loves us, he protects us, he gives us charity. And there is no he, it's just the source that we came from. Your reactions to the self you made are not surprising, he says. In fact, they resemble in many ways how you will one day react to your real creations, which are as timeless as you are. So what he's saying is that when we wake up one day, when we are no longer choosing ego and instead we choose spirit, when we do that, our real creations will be knowing that we are one with God and one another, extending love eternally, and that is our real creation. And so one day when we are awakened, this is how we will react to our real creations, just as God reacts to us. And those creations are timeless, he tells us, because we are eternal beings. The question is not how you respond to the ego, but what you believe you are. It's always going to come down to the foundation, what we believe we are. What is the foundation of that belief? Belief is an ego function. And as long as your origin is open to belief, you are regarding it from an ego viewpoint. When teaching is no longer necessary, meaning when we are awakened, you will merely know God. That is when we will be in knowledge. Belief that there is another way of perceiving is the loftiest idea of which ego thinking is capable. That is because it contains a hint of recognition that the ego is not the self. So even though our ultimate goal is to be in knowledge, to let go of the ego world and to not even use perception, while we think we're here in this ego world, he's telling us the loftiest thing that we can do is to perceive correctly. Perception is just a tool while we are here in this illusory world. When we go home to God, there is no need for perception. We are not perceiving anything. We just know we are one with God. We are love extending eternally. But as long as we have a mistaken belief in the lie, in the ego thought system, the tool that we use to awaken is perception. But instead of perceiving wrongly, which means choosing ego, we perceive correctly, which means choosing God. So we have to make that choice, that perception for what is true, what is real, over and over and over and over again. We have to keep practicing. We have to make it a habit until we no longer need perception, because we will no longer believe in this world at all. And we will be completely awakened to knowledge, to the truth. That's why perceiving correctly is the greatest thing we can do within the ego thought system, because that helps us eventually wake up and go home. This is the stepping stone that gets us to this. Undermining the ego's thought system must be perceived as painful, even though this is anything but true. Okay, our egos think it's painful, but it's actually not true because our egos don't even exist. Truthfully, when we choose God, when we choose spirit, when we choose our true self, that is when we are leaving pain behind. But that's not how the ego sees it, because the ego doesn't want to die. So it sees undermining its own thought system as painful. Babies scream in rage if you take away a knife or scissors, although they may well harm themselves if you do not. In this sense, you are still a baby, okay? Jesus is always speaking to us throughout the course as if we are babies, as if we are tiny children, because the way that we are using our mind, we are acting like babies and tiny children. He's about to explain further. Okay, so in this sense, you are still a baby. You have no sense of real self-preservation and are likely to decide that you need precisely what would hurt you most. Okay, that's choosing the ego. It's choosing the ego thought system that hurts us the most. But we are tiny children. We do not understand choosing the ego thought system. He's equating here to a baby or a young child having a pair of scissors or a knife, that they could harm themselves, but they don't know that. And that's why a baby or toddler will scream and cry when you take those things away from them, because they don't understand that they're harmful. Just like us. We don't understand how harmful the ego thought system is to us. Yet whether or not you recognize it now, you have agreed to cooperate in the effort to become both harmless and helpful, attributes that go together. Okay, so he's saying whether or not we are aware of it right now, that we have agreed to cooperate with things that are helpful to us, meaning that we have agreed to awaken. Why? Because there's no other choice. We are all going to awaken because we're not here. We are really home with God in heaven, which is a state of oneness with one another and with God. That's our real home. We're not really here in these bodies in this world. So that's why we have agreed to do it, because it's already done. It is who we really are. Your attitudes, even towards this, are necessarily conflicted, because all attitudes are ego-based. Okay, so even though as humans in bodies, we feel like we want to be helpful, we want to not cause harm, and we want to be helpful, that's because in our innate spirit self, these are our real attributes. But we mistakenly make them ego-based. And that's how we end up hurting ourselves, even though we are trying to be helpful. So that's why he's saying when these things are ego-based, he says, this will not last. Be patient a while and remember that the outcome is as certain as God. So even though this illusory world will not last, nothing here is real, everything here is temporary, he's saying don't worry and be patient and remember that the outcome with God is certain. Why? Because we're already there. It's already done. This world is already over. It was just a thought for a moment, a mistaken thought where we thought we separated from God, but nothing actually ever happened. So this is what we will eventually remember. And that's why he's saying, be patient. The outcome is certain. It simply depends upon us waking up and remembering the truth. That's it. Only those who have a real and lasting sense of abundance can be truly charitable. He doesn't mean anything worldly in that statement, okay? What he's talking about, this real and lasting abundance, is those who know that they are one with God. When we know that we are spirit, that is the abundance he speaks of. And only when we know that can we be truly charitable, which simply means practicing forgiveness. It means being able to look upon the world and know that everything that we are looking upon is truly spirit. That is what he means by being charitable. This is obvious when you consider what is involved. He's always telling us how obvious all of this is. So when we consider what is involved, meaning that the ego world is false and spirit world is true, it becomes obvious. To the ego, to give anything implies that you will have to do without, right? Because egos think that there is a lack. When we're giving, we think we're losing something. When you associate giving with sacrifice, that's just what I said. When you associate giving with sacrifice, you give only because you believe that you are somehow getting something better and can therefore do without the thing you give. And then he puts in quotes, giving to get. All right. This is how our whole world is based, our ego world, right? It's all about giving to get. It's all about lack. It's all about, if I have more, that means someone else has less. But he's telling us, no, none of that's true. These are all just nightmare dreams of our ego mistaken illusion. So giving to get is an inescapable law of the ego, which always evaluates itself in relation to other egos, right? More lack perception, more separation perception. It is therefore continually preoccupied with the belief in scarcity that gave rise to it. All right. He's saying the whole reason that the ego was ever even made to begin with was out of the belief of scarcity, a belief in separation, that we separated from God and we destroyed heaven. That's why we made the ego to begin with. So he's saying we are continually preoccupied with the belief in scarcity. This is what keeps the ego going. Its whole perception of other egos as real is only an attempt to convince itself that it is real. So he's saying as we look out into the world thinking we're seeing other egos, we only do that because we want to believe that we are real as well. Self-esteem, he puts in quotes, is always vulnerable to stress, a term which refers to any perceived threat to the ego's existence. So self-esteem that he's putting in quotes, he's saying is completely coming from the ego. It's just a way for the ego to build itself up because it feels vulnerable. The ego literally lives by comparisons. Equality is beyond its grasp, and charity becomes impossible. Okay, so because egos don't know that we are all one, and thinks that we're all separate, and thinks that we're all in competition, and that there is a lack of abundance that we all need to compete over, this is why egos literally live by comparison, he's saying. And equality is beyond its grasp. Why? Because the ego doesn't know that we are really this, right? The ego believes it's this. And that is why charity is impossible, because you have no charity to give when you're in this world of lack and separation. We only have charity to give to others, which can also be called practicing forgiveness, when we know that we are really spirit, when we know that everyone is all the same, when we look upon the world knowing that everyone and everything is one with one another and with God. That is charity. Then we can give. The ego never gives out of abundance because it was made as a substitute for it. right? The ego doesn't know about abundance. The ego only knows about lack. That is why the concept of getting arose in the ego's thought system. Appetites are getting mechanisms, representing the ego's need to confirm itself. This is as true of body appetites as it is of the so-called higher ego needs. Body appetites are not physical in origin. The ego regards the body as its home, and it tries to satisfy itself through the body. But the idea that this is possible is a decision of the mind, which has become completely confused about what is really possible. Egos have appetites of all kinds, right? All sorts of things that we desire in this world that we think we are lacking. And he's using the example of even just the body having an appetite for food. He's saying that that is a belief that actually comes from our mind. The body is just symbolic of our belief in the ego thought system, our belief in separation. The body is our proof to ourselves that we are separate beings in this world, that we don't even know is an illusion. So he's not saying not to eat. And he's not saying that if you have a body and you eat, that means you're doing it wrong. He's not saying anything like that ever, ever, ever. Jesus never wants us to feel bad about mistakenly believing that we have bodies. And he's never encouraging us to not love our bodies. He just is encouraging us to know that our bodies are not real. And when we align with Holy Spirit, as long as we appear to be in a body, we will make loving decisions for ourselves and our body. But instead of coming from a place of lack, what the ego believes in, it will be coming from a place of abundance, what Spirit believes in, because it's coming from Source, it's coming from God. And that is the process to help us wake up. And then eventually we won't need bodies anymore because we won't be believing that we are separate. The ego believes it is completely on its own, which is merely another way of describing how it thinks it originated, right? Because the making of the ego originated when we thought we separated from God and heaven. So since we thought we were completely on our own, when we had the mistaken thought of separating from God, and we thought we really did it, so we thought that we were completely on our own. And that is how the ego even came to be. This is such a fearful state that it can only turn to other egos and try to unite with them in a feeble attempt at identification, or attack them in an equally feeble show of strength. Okay, so he's saying that because we think we're separate beings and it fills us with so much fear to feel like we're separate and alone, that in this illusory world, we will try to come together with other egos, trying to fill that hole, that void inside of us where we feel alone. So we try to solve that and fill that hole with other beings, but it never works. Or the other thing that egos do, will try to attack other people to make itself feel strong in its isolation. We think we're separate beings. It really terrifies us to feel like we're alone and separate beings, but egos want to feel powerful, so they will also attack other egos to make themselves feel like they are more powerful than other egos. Because if you're believing in lack, you have to take in order to get some, right? Not true, but it's what egos think. It is not free, however, meaning the ego, to open the premise to question, because the premise is its foundation. The ego is not going to question its own lie. The ego is not going to question the entire premise that its world is built upon. The ego is the mind's belief that it is completely on its own. The ego's ceaseless attempts to gain the Spirit's acknowledgement and thus establish its own existence are useless. Spirit, in its knowledge, is unaware of the ego. It does not attack. It merely cannot conceive of it at all. While the ego is equally unaware of Spirit. It does perceive itself as being rejected by something greater than itself. So Spirit has no knowledge of the ego. Why? Because it doesn't even exist. It's not real. This is real. This is eternal. This is stable. It knows not of this at all because it does not exist. However, we think we're here. And while we're here, we are aware of spirit. That is Holy Spirit whispering to us. That is the voice that we hear that calls us to the course, that calls us to any kind of spirituality that we have been drawn to in our lives, because we know there is something more. So even though spirit is not at all aware of ego, ego has a tiny, tiny bit of inkling of spirit, because we can never entirely lose what we really are. And he's telling us that any attempts that the ego has made to bring spirituality into its world is useless. It will never work. And this is what we all keep trying to do. All egos keep trying to bring the spirit world into the illusory world to make their world real. This is what egos are all doing. This is what we are all doing. But it's not possible, he's telling us. It's useless. This is why self-esteem in ego terms must be delusional. The creations of God do not create myths, although creative effort can be turned into mythology. Spirit is incapable of creating a myth, but ego can make mythology. It can do so, however, only under one condition. What it makes is then no longer creative. When the ego makes a mythology, it's not creative. Only spirit can create. We can make up as many lies as we want. We can make up as much mythology as we want, but it doesn't make it true. It's useless. Myths are entirely perceptual, okay? Using perception comes from the ego. And so ambiguous in form and characteristically good and evil in nature that the most benevolent of them is not without fearful connotations. Okay, a bunch of words to mean duality when he's talking about good and evil and the characteristics and so on and so forth. In the ego world, we have duality. So we're always going to have good and evil, or things that represent duality. So he's saying even the most benevolent of myths is still going to have fearful connotations within it. The most benevolent of anything in our illusory world is still always going to have negative connotations in it, because this is a world of duality. You can't have one without the other. Myths and magic are closely associated, since myths are usually related to ego origins and magic to the powers the ego ascribes to itself. Mythological systems generally include some account of the creation and associate this with its particular form of magic. The so-called battle for survival is only the ego's struggle to perceive itself and its interpretation of its own beginning. This beginning is usually associated with physical birth, because it's hard to maintain that the ego existed before that point in time. The more religiously ego-oriented may believe that the soul existed before and will continue to exist after a temporary lapse in the ego's life. Some even believe that the soul will be punished for this lapse. However, salvation does not apply to spirit, which is not in danger and does not need to be salvaged. Okay, that was a mouthful. That was a lot of different explanations to talk about how we don't need to be saved. Nobody here needs to be saved. We are not our egos. We are spirit. Spirit doesn't need to be saved. He's listing different ways that egos mistake our origin story. He's talking about birth, right? That would be considered from bodies, how we came to be. He's talking about a religious perspective, right? Where we need to be saved. Our souls need to be saved. He's talking about sort of a more new age perspective about reincarnation and, souls learning lessons and things like that. He's saying that all of it is nonsense. None of it is true. That is not where we came from. It is not who we are. We did not sin. We don't need to learn anything. We don't have karma that we need to balance. We made all of that up. That's all part of the world of duality, of earning our way to God, that we have somehow sinned and we need to earn it. We need to prove that we are worthy of God's love. This is all mistaken ego belief. None of it is real. The truth is that we are already home with God. No one needs to earn it. It is who we already are. We are one with God. We are love. Salvation is nothing more than right-mindedness, okay? So this thing about being saved, right? We don't need to earn it. We don't need to prove anything to God. It's simply an awakening. When we wake up to our truth, that is what salvation is. And it's about being right-minded. It's about using that tool of perception to perceive correctly when we are lost in our dream, so that we can start to remember who we really are. That is right-mindedness. It also could be called practicing forgiveness. When you look upon the world and know that everyone and everything is just spirit, that is right-mindedness. All right, so salvation is nothing more than right-mindedness, which is not the one-mindedness of the Holy Spirit, but which must be achieved before one-mindedness is restored. Right-mindedness leads to the next step automatically because right perception is uniformly without attack, and therefore wrong-mindedness is obliterated. So he's explaining to us that one-mindedness comes from this world, comes from our truth, comes from our reality. But we don't know this yet because we're still asleep in this world. So when we're asleep in this world, we need perception. We need to perceive correctly, which is also known as right-mindedness. We need to use this tool over and over and over and over and over again till we get to knowledge, until we wake up. So he's saying that even though right-mindedness is needed in order to go home, right-mindedness is not the same as one-mindedness. But as long as we believe that we are here in this illusory world, we are not capable of one-mindedness yet. So we have to use perception to perceive correctly, to have right-mindedness. We need this stepping stone, this tool, to eventually get us here. The ego cannot survive without judgment and is laid aside accordingly. The mind then has only one direction in which it can move. Its direction is always automatic because it cannot but be dictated by the thought system to which it adheres. Okay, so our mind is going to automatically behave according to which thought system we are adhering to. Right now, we are all adhering to this thought system. Our goal is to adhere to this thought system. It cannot be emphasized too often that correcting perception is merely a temporary expedient, right? Perception is a temporary tool for us to use as long as we believe that we are in this mistaken world. It is necessary only because misinterpretation is a block to knowledge. In other words, wrong-minded thinking. Wrong-minded thinking is a block to knowledge, while accurate perception is a stepping stone towards it, meaning right-minded perception. Right-minded perception is a stepping stone towards knowledge. The whole value of right perception lies in the inevitable realization that all perception is unnecessary. It's his way of saying it's all a dream. It's not even real. Perception isn't even necessary. But because we think we're here, we're going to use it to get us home. He says this removes the block entirely. You may ask how this is possible as long as you appear to be living in this world. That is a reasonable question. You must be careful, however, that you really understand it. Who is the you who are living in this world? Spirit is immortal, and immortality is a constant state. It is as true now as it ever was or ever will be, because it implies no change at all. That's spirit. Spirit implies no change, and that is what we really are. It is not a continuum, nor is it understood by being compared to an opposite. Okay, spirit is not a part of a continuum. It cannot be identified by comparing it to opposites. Knowledge never involves comparisons. That is the main difference from everything else the mind can grasp. So we are so used to the ego thought system that we think of everything in terms of comparisons. We think of everything in terms of lack versus abundance. This is how we think of things. But what our mind is being trained to do with A Course in Miracles is to overlook those mistakes, to overlook the lie, to overlook it so that we can focus on truth, so that we can know truth. It's simply a habit. It's simply like going to the gym and building muscles. It's the same thing, but you're building the muscle of your mind. Understanding that you are the chooser. You get to choose which thought system you're going to identify with. When we are identifying with the ego thought system, we believe that we have to compete and judge and attack in order to survive. And when we are living life that way, it does not feel peaceful. And that's why so many of us are drawn to the messages of the Course, because we want peace. And peace comes from knowing who and what we really are, which is one with one another, one with God, extending love eternally.